This video is going to appeal most to three types of people. Those who are interested in art and media criticism, those who are interested in video game design, and those who are interested in Europa Universalis IV. You don't need to have played EU4 or any video game for that matter to understand this video. This isn't a review of the game, nor is it really a retrospective. Instead, this is an exploration of the narratives that emerge from EU4's gameplay and content. If nothing else, this video is about using a narrative lens to examine a game that has been out for just over 10 years now and has established itself in that time as a juggernaut for the genre, as well as possibly the last game of its kind. If there's one thing I want you to get out of this video, it's that all forms of art and media convey narratives relevant to our current time and cultural context, even strategy video games. While EU4 might not necessarily be trying to say something about the world, it ends up saying a great many things, both about the past and the present, and I think it's important to think carefully and critically about the narratives we consume and spread. In the end, that's the whole point of art, to look ourselves in the mirror and think a little differently about what we see. I'm hoping that by the end of this video, you'll look at your own ideas of power, violence, and government just a little bit differently. A couple of things to note before we jump in. This being a long-form video essay, I've written it in a way that doesn't require your eyes at all. I'll show visuals on screen for illustrative purposes, but at no point will this on-screen information be necessary to understanding what I'm saying. So by all means, put this video on another tab while you do other things, or listen on your phone as you go for a walk outside. So what is narrative? The word comes from the Latin verb narrare, meaning to tell, or to describe, similar to the English verb to narrate, meaning to tell a story. We could debate whether all human speech counts as elements of a story, but now we're getting a little too abstract. For the purposes of analyzing emergent narratives in EU4, I'm using narrative more as a catch-all concept to describe the experience of storytelling through a given medium. For example, while you might argue that the Lord of the Rings movies and novels tell the same story, they are very different narratives. The novels rely on a heavily poetic and nature-focused writing style to convey ideas that goodness is about small, everyday people resisting evil, while the movies rely on long action sequences that were practically skipped over in the books to try to convey the very same theme. Just as poetic prose about nature and long action sequences are tools for storytellers across literature and film, games have their own toolset for conveying meaning to their audience. If you've played Europa Universalis IV or other strategy games, you might be wondering what narratives I could possibly be talking about. Strategy games are generally not designed for players to engage with stories. Instead, they're more like a set of systems for two or more players, whether human or AI, to compete. This is where the emergent part in emergent narrative comes into the picture. While EU4 and other games in the grand strategy genre are not mainly intended as vehicles for storytelling, their gameplay systems and historical content mean that narratives about the real world are present in every action the player can take. To hammer this point home, take a more universally known strategy game, chess. In chess, the pieces have official names that convey meaning that relates to the real world. If we take these names seriously within the context of the game, and look at the piece called the King, we could say that chess conveys a number of narratives. The king is only as strong as his army, or the king is the most important thing to protect in a war. If you think these interpretations take the king's role too literally, that is sort of the point. Games convey narratives, even if we don't care to look at the meaning of them. Everything in chess, from the color and the shape of the pieces to the rules, conveys implicit meaning. Another great example of this is how knights in chess move, forward and to the side, which looks just like how horse-mounted soldiers would typically be deployed to flank an opponent in pre-industrial warfare. Like chess, Europa Universalis IV depicts aspects of the real world in abstract, gamified terms. Unlike chess, however, EU4 is intended to represent the experience of ruling an entire state, and the developers had to pick and choose which aspects of this idea are represented. These choices are then depicted using the language of video games. Gameplay systems, visuals, text, sound, and artificial intelligence. On top of that, EU4 is a deeply historical game where players embody a specific state at a specific time in history, and these diegetic elements of the game are necessarily more explicit in their rendition of historical narratives. I want to stress at this point that the narratives that emerge from gameplay are not necessarily intentional on the part of the game's creators. Some are and some aren't, but it really doesn't matter for the purposes of this analysis. This goes back to the whole question of whether the meaning we find in art is intentional or not, and whether that even matters. If you clicked on this video, chances are you're not someone who hates the idea of looking for meaning in art, whether it was put there on purpose or not. Of course, the question of what something might mean differs between any given culture and any individual person. I'm not just trying to say that interpretations of art are subjective, which is basically a redundant sentence, but also that the interpretations and arguments I'm going to make about EU4 are specific to my time and place, to my experiences and my beliefs. Just like EU4 pushes certain narratives about history, war, economics, and other topics, this video is pushing certain narratives about EU4 and all of those topics. The choices I make, intentional or not, in this video also propagate narratives, and that's part of why I love making and criticizing art. Another thing I want to get out of the way right at the beginning is that I love this game. I started playing it back in 2015 when I was in high school and have not stopped playing it to this day, nigh on 10 years later. That said, I'm going to have a lot of criticism about some of the narratives I describe and analyze in this video, because it's more than possible to enjoy something while finding aspects of it unpleasant, harmful, or outright offensive. I'm going to pick apart this game that I have spent so much time with, dissecting the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of narratives that emerge from gameplay systems and content. This is a game with a lot of moving parts, a lot of interesting simultaneous narratives to explore. If you're looking for a central thesis, I'm not going to impose one. Instead, this video is going to present many different arguments and perspectives, and I think it's fitting that I don't force all of those ideas to fit into one specific argument or narrative. Europa Universalis IV, commonly known as EU4, is a grand strategy game developed and published by Paradox Interactive, a studio based in Stockholm, Sweden. The game launched in 2013 as the fourth main title in the Europa Universalis series, which were based on a 1993 board game with the same name, with the first adaptation being released in 2000. I point this out because while 13 years had passed between the publication of the original Europa Universalis video game and Europa Universalis IV, as of writing it has been just over 10 years since Europa Universalis IV released. If you haven't heard of Paradox Interactive, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this long gap since the release of EU4 might mean that either the game or Paradox Studio has not been successful in the past 10 years, but you'd be wrong. The last 10 years have seen Paradox Interactive become one of the most prominent publishers for strategy titles, and I would argue that they are the most important strategy publisher today in terms of the range of the recent successes across a variety of IPs. Paradox champions a style of strategy games that is often described as real-time grand strategy and practically doesn't exist anywhere else. The term grand strategy refers to games where the focus is on strategy on a large scale and high level of abstraction. In these games, players usually manage an entire country across a variety of domains like the military, government, and economy. In contrast, tactical strategy games, which are more small scale and concrete, usually focus on an individual battle or managing a small settlement. The term real-time refers to the fact that time passes in-game, rather than being represented as a discrete turn. For example, chess is a turn-based tactical strategy, Age of Empires is real-time tactical strategy, and Civilization is turn-based grand strategy. Real-time grand strategy games like EU4 are exceedingly rare, and most of the better-known titles in the past decade have been developed or published by Paradox. This is due to these games generally having an unusually high barrier to entry. We're talking a couple hours before a player generally feels equipped enough to get a basic handle on what's going on. There's a popular meme in the EU4 community that the tutorial ends when you reach 1444 hours of playtime, which is the same number as the in-game year that the game starts. This is obviously hyperbole, but the deep interconnectedness and complexity of all the gameplay systems means that you can't learn each one independently like you would in many other games. And on top of that, each one literally takes thousands of hours to master. The required investment is almost never as high just to understand the fundamentals of a game as it is in EU4. This barrier to entry deters a large number of players from picking up the game, and Paradox has shown in the last 10 years that it is willing to massively simplify and improve the accessibility of its newer titles. But there hasn't been an EU5, and that's because despite the huge cost of entry, EU4 maintains a perhaps smaller but also more devoted community of players who count their playtime in the hundreds of hours. Paradox has monetized this not so massive but very dedicated player base by releasing new paid content several times a year since release. The system has been largely unpopular in recent years due to many of the DLCs not feeling worth their price, which is usually $20 in the United States. I'm not going to get into all the details of the DLC drama in this video, but the point is that EU4 today is not even close to the same game I started playing in 2015. It has been injected with 10 years worth of both free and paid content updates, and its mechanics have grown in number and complexity. I'm making this video towards what I assume must be the end of this game's life, but I can't really guarantee that things won't be changed or added, so I'll be working through the game at a high level as much as possible, focusing primarily on the core fundamentals of play and the ensuing narrative experiences. It's worth taking a second to describe EU4's mechanics at this point for people who might be unfamiliar. EU4 is a map-based strategy game where the player controls every aspect of one particular country's behavior, including its military, economy, government, diplomacy, technology, and trade, as well as managing the nation's factions, reforms, and religious groups. From a high-level, mechanical perspective, EU4 is all about understanding how each of the game's dozens of currencies, like money, manpower, prestige, and diplomatic reputation, all relate to one another. Playing EU4 is about managing all of these resources and investing them to generate future gains, while also optimizing play to avoid unnecessary costs. At a lower level, minute-to-minute gameplay is defined by players clicking on various user interface panels on the left, right, bottom, and top of their screens to seek information to make decisions, while also interacting with the world map. I say decisions because the actions a player can take at any one time are vast both in quantity and variety. Here are some examples of what you can do at any given time. You can move your armies, but you can also change your trading policy for a specific trade hub, or you can ally one of your friendlier neighbors. You can insult a nearby rival, or you can decide to sell your entire navy to another country. You can lower taxes in your capital, you can hire a mercenary company, you could send a colonist to North America, you can hire a theologian to help convert some of your population to the state religion. All of these actions are potentially simultaneous, and now you understand why EU4 poses such a problem of overwhelming new players. You could say that the game's map is similar to a very large chessboard, with the player's armies and navies serving the role of chess pieces, and individual provinces serving the role of the board's squares. Of course, the player is not alone in the world, which is full of countries, some friendly and some hostile, all of which provides additional information for players to take into account when making their decisions. So what is the goal of the game? Because of its vast amount of strategic freedom at any moment, EU4 easily becomes a game where players create their own goals, in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. Generating and prioritizing goals is an essential skill in playing the game. The ultimate aim of a given campaign involves using the game's mechanics to achieve a desired outcome, which can be as simple as forming one of the modern states that does not exist in the starting year of 1444, such as Germany or Italy. More experienced players might aim to simply conquer and control as much land as possible by the end of the game, or to conquer the entire world as quickly as possible. Other challenges are popular in the community, encouraged explicitly by EU4's development team, who continually adds new challenge achievements to the game. Possibly the most famous achievement due to its difficulty in the early years of the game is the Three Mountains, which requires that you play the game as Ryukyu, a tiny island country that controls what is today Japan's Okinawa prefecture, and conquer the world. On top of specific challenges, the game also features a difficulty selection at the start of the campaign, allowing for new challenge to be added by playing on hard or very hard difficulty. EU4 is a game that has a built-in sense of time and progression. The game begins in 1444 and ends in 1821, meaning that every decision or investment is done within that time frame. The game provides controls to the player to pause time or to speed it up in discrete increments from 1 to 5. The game's speed and frequency of pauses varies from player to player. I knew someone in high school who played exclusively at the highest speed and paused constantly. Time is an important resource to EU4 players, both in-game and in real life. A typical game played all the way to 1821 can take anywhere from 20 to 50 real hours. The first time I completed a world conquest, the last 30 years of the game alone took me almost 10 hours as I scrambled to do everything in time to conquer the world by the end of the game. Multiplayer is an important aspect of EU4 that I won't be touching on much in this video. In multiplayer, some countries are controlled by other human players, which involves both the usual mechanics of single player, as well as the added factor of human intelligence, competition, and communication that can sometimes subvert the mechanics of the game. An example of this is that two players can make each other promises of alliance in secret without using the in-game alliance mechanic to prevent other human players from knowing about their collaboration. Backstabbing is also an important part of EU4 multiplayer, and managing human relationships becomes a gameplay system in itself, calling back to the more social experience of playing the original tabletop board game. Playing EU4 is, as you can probably tell, intense. It requires an understanding of the minute-by-minute mechanics, as well as long-term planning that spans tens of hours within a single game. It rewards players by creating a framework of possible strategies within which challenges can be accomplished, the result of which is a high investment experience that provides, essentially, a feeling of surmounting the insurmountable. Players' feelings of accomplishment ultimately arise from the sum of their achievements and their ability at navigating the game's challenges. Thus, the motivation for starting a fresh EU4 campaign comes from seeking out new challenges and feeling yourself rise to meet them. At its core, EU4 allows players to experience a power fantasy. Players embody the state itself and typically wield much more power than any of the governments represented in the game actually did historically. Fundamentally, this is because the player holds all the power within the confines of the country they are playing as. Every state resource is at their disposal, and every soldier is basically just a number on a spreadsheet, eternally loyal to every command. Everything is up to the player: reform, religious conversion, taxation, trade, and of course war. This means that the player is in a way the only person who exists in the country they are ruling, and it fulfills that fantasy of, if I were in charge, I would do this. The fantasy of the individual imposing their will on massive systems and steering society is very much at the core of the EU4 narrative experience, and forms the core gameplay motivation and thematic throughline across all mechanics in the game. Of course, it's not uncommon in video games to have the player be hyper-enfranchised to the point of godhood, but it is noteworthy that in EU4, within the confines of your own state, there are no real checks on your power, and nothing happens within the country without your approval. Other games, like for example the Paradox title Imperator Rome, do include internal actors outside the player's control. In that game, generals commanding the player's armies can become disloyal if their in-game characters become dissatisfied with the player's decisions, leading to those armies operating independently and potentially turning against the government itself. EU4 does not include any mechanics that truly put game decisions outside the hands of the all-powerful player. I suspect this is for two main reasons. First is that EU4 operates at a higher level of abstraction than a game like Imperator, especially when it comes to war. Imperator includes mechanics for logistics and tactics that is not within the mechanical scope of EU4 at all, and so it could be inferred that wrenching armies out of the player's control in a game with a more strategic scope rather than a more tactical one would not really fit with the rest of EU4's design. The second reason is more narrative. I strongly suspect the designers wanted to focus mechanically on representing the global European empires that appeared between the 15th and 19th centuries. Now, global empires spanning continents have never really been just a European thing, but from the 1400s to the 1800s, Europe saw a massive rise in the centralization of its states, with things like feudal systems that were more dependent on the king, absolutist monarchies, and even urbanization and nationalism. Technologies like printing eventually revolutionized government administrations, and modern historians even suspect that the Black Plague had a massive effect on the centralization of Europe in the subsequent centuries. And that's to say nothing of the colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia that allowed European states to accumulate more wealth and manpower from outside their home territories, further strengthening the highest rungs of government in relation to local forces, leading to stronger central governments. But what about the rest of the world?
Europa Universalis is a highly Eurocentric game, but with its title, we make no apologies for that. But there's certain problems with countries that don't quite fit the mold of a European state.
That's designer Chris King acknowledging EU3's Eurocentrism in a Meet the Team video for EU3's Divine Wind expansion, which added features for the Far East, especially Ming, China. King is credited as being on the scripting and research team for EU3, as well as being a game designer on EU4, and I completely agree with his assessment of the game. This is where I'm going to introduce a concept that's going to recur throughout the entire analysis. EU4 is an extremely Eurocentric game. The game presents deeply Eurocentric portrayals not just of historical events, but also all of the ideas embedded into the game's mechanics, and in this specific case, the conceptualization and development of the state. I think it's safe to say that people who create these systems know the limitations of EU4's mechanical and narrative perspective, and know that the systems of power they're creating in the game don't really apply to the entire globe, as King stated in the video. And in some ways, Paradox really is incentivized to maintain this Eurocentric approach. They're a European company and their primary customer base is also European. In 2014, lead designer Johan Andersson posted a list on the official EU4 Paradox forum that shows the top 15 countries that players selected the most. Of these 15, only 2 were non-European countries, those being the Ottoman Empire, which is inextricably involved with European history, and Japan. This is undoubtedly because certain countries are highlighted in the game's starting lobby as interesting choices during this period. The countries that receive this prestigious position as the suggested play for new and inexperienced players are the Ottomans, Castile, Portugal, France, England, Austria, Brandenburg, Sweden, Muscovy, Burgundy, and Poland, all of which find themselves on Johan's 15 most popular countries list. But this begs the question, should developers make Europe the focus of the game because that's what people want to play, or do people want to play in Europe because that's what the developers chose as the focus of the game? This is a question I think we should continue to keep in mind as we get deeper into the Eurocentrism of the game's systems and mechanics. The kind of absolute power wielded by the player can be seen as mechanically resonant with the themes of increased centralization and empire in European states, even if that means painting all of Europe with that one brush. But this narrative and its accompanying mechanics can really feel out of place when you look at what was happening basically anywhere else in the world at that point. Morocco is a great example of this. Playing as Morocco really has identical mechanics in terms of the player's centralized power as the neighboring Spanish kingdoms, despite the fact that Morocco is extremely decentralized in this period, to the point where the Amazigh tribes in the mountains are often indifferent to their alleged king, even if nominally subjugated. In most of the world, including Morocco, it was a specific royal family, clan, or tribal authority that formed the unit of political control of a territory, rather than the concept of a state. But in EU4, we get to play Morocco basically as a completely centralized kingdom, complete with taxes on the population equivalent to those living in cities controlled by a centralized state, despite this not at all being the case. And I just want to point out, EU4 does have a mechanic called local autonomy that is meant to represent the state control over a given territory. The problem is that local autonomy is not representative because the game starts with every Moroccan province at 0%, meaning complete centralization. In the current version of the game, the Moroccan territory is subdivided into Morocco and 3 vassal kingdoms, Tafilalt, Sousse, and Marrakech, I guess to represent the sort of indirect control the Moroccan kingdom had over these territories. The issue is, annexing these territories and centralizing them really is trivial, and on top of that, this setup means that the vassal kingdoms themselves have complete authority over their lands, which again doesn't really line up with what we know about Morocco in this period, and you can apply this example to many countries in the game. There's another game mechanic that might help illustrate this point a little further. Every province has a value called development, which represents the sum of 3 categories: base tax, base production, and base manpower. These 3 values affect the province's tax, production, and manpower output as you'd expect, but also affect other stats like province's trade power. Development can be understood as representing the real-world concepts of population and land productivity, a kind of GDP for the game. And just like GDP, the value intentionally abstracts away a lot of considerations, like whether the production is more rural or urbanized, whether the population benefits from higher living standards, etc. As such, we could consider that the game views higher development as another way of representing higher central government control over an area. A low development province, therefore, might be productive and populated, but doesn't share that wealth or manpower with the central government. Seen this way, it does make a lot of sense that a lot of the least urbanized and decentralized territories in EU4 have lower development values. But if we look at the development of those Moroccan provinces that should be out of the reach of the central government's authority, we see that the development is just as high as the rest of Morocco. It also makes sense that increasing development costs administrative, diplomatic, or military power in order to, from a narrative perspective, strengthen the presence of the central government in a province. After all, the player is in control of one particular central regime, not the local authorities that might see and derive much more value from supposedly undeveloped territories. The cynical interpretation of this concept of development is that the game represents populations and territories that are urbanized and centralized by the state as developed in the civilizational sense, while the rest of the world is deemed more or less worthless unless it produces gold. Of course, by defining development in these terms, which conform to the historical conditions of Europe in the 15th century, Europe gets a massive head start in 1444, but we'll get into that economic perspective later on in the section dedicated to economics. Power is practically zero-sum in EU4, which means that nearly all the power the player gains is at the expense of another country. As I mentioned before, the sense of progression and the accumulation of power is the primary motivation behind the player's actions. Power accumulation is represented on one hand as the growth of the player's experience and ability to steer the ship of state, including learning to navigate the mechanics in an optimal way. Knowing how to place, move, and organize armies is a great example of power accumulation that lasts even when you restart the game, and this sort of power allows the player to seek out more difficult challenges. But within the confines of a single playthrough, the player has to accumulate tangible power. This tangible power is represented through various currencies. At the national level, every player has to manage money, manpower, prestige, stability, power projection, and the 3 core governmental powers mentioned earlier: administrative, diplomatic, and military power. On top of these, there are situational currencies that depend on the religion or government type, like legitimacy for monarchies, republican tradition for republics, papal influence for Catholics, or piety for Muslims, and many others. These currencies are generated through a combination of your ruler's ability, bonuses earned through missions, decisions chosen by the player, and economic factors. For example, while there are several bonuses to taxation efficiency that can be earned throughout the game, the raw taxable amount will always be dependent on output from the province's development values I mentioned earlier. The system of power naturally incentivizes a zero-sum thought process where any economic output in the world that isn't going into your treasury is basically value lost to the player. Not only that, but because the player is only one country among hundreds on the world stage, economic power generated by neighboring countries necessarily means more money and manpower to support armies, leading to more difficult wars when the AI inevitably declares war on the player. And because of how the AI operates, war is practically inevitable for any player, because nearby countries will conquer one another until a victor emerges and turns towards the player's lands for potential conquest. To be clear, I'm not criticizing this in itself. EU4 is a war game, and my own personal playstyle in the game is basically a total war with every neighbor as much as possible. Like chess, EU4 offers no alternative to growing your power except by weakening the power of others. And because EU4 is representing a historical context, it is indirectly commenting on the mode of power espoused by states during this period. It's not like the game is entirely unrealistic. The 15th through the 19th centuries included plenty of political zero-sum thinking, like notions of balance of power, realpolitik, and mercantilism. Oh wait, we're talking about European ideas again, aren't we? This is sort of the problem I have with everything in this game. The developers clearly put a lot of work into building systems that mechanically represent the historical context, but more often than not, the historical context only means the European historical context. And I would still argue that the historical trajectory of the West did not strictly necessitate global conquest as a means of growth in power, but instead that imperialist narratives were simply popular within the ruling class in order to consolidate their dominion over their home population. But I'm not a historian. So what does this mean for EU4? Is the game representing narratives that it believes represent the people in power during the period? Is it representing narratives that derive from historical trends? Or is it representing a contemporary perspective on the past? There's a pervasive historical determinism present throughout all of EU4's mechanics. On one hand, the game offers the possibility of many different historical situations, like for example England winning the 100 Years' War and creating a unified kingdom in France. Part of the fun of the game is the creation of alternate histories, both by player influence and the decisions of non-player countries. But at the same time, the narratives of power that are embedded into these systems railroad the player into making the same decisions that major European powers of the time made in order to increase their domestic power, which is to expand as much as possible in a very specific form of Western imperialism. You might say that this is realistic given the conditions of the period, or that this is historically accurate. But throughout this essay, I'm going to be showing ways in which the game prioritizes both European supremacy and a very specific brand of player freedom over historical accuracy. For now, you may be thinking, isn't it possible to increase the power of a nation through internal means, such as increasing province development? Yes. Developing provinces is an essential aspect of the mechanics in specific situations, like maximizing profit from certain centers of trade, or by developing to bring one of the various global institutions to that province. We'll talk about institutions later, but they are basically the gatekeepers to technological progression in the game. Developing provinces systematically rather than just in these precise situations is a playstyle the EU4 community calls playing tall. People will say that playing tall is finally viable because of recent updates, but due to some of the inherent mechanics of the game, it really isn't incentivized and becomes something more of a meme or a challenge run, like playing without alliances or without taking loans. Playing tall fails to catch up to the efficiency of conquest as a means to prevent neighbors from encroaching on the player. What's better, taking a 10 development province from someone else, or adding 10 development to your own province? Because of the costs associated with developing a province, in the vast majority of situations, it's more costly to develop your own province than to take someone else's for an equivalent amount of development. Not only that, but a new province serves as a potential development location in the future, and as mentioned, many of the game's systems are zero-sum or depend on the control of very specific strategic territories. For example, if you want to form Germany or the Mongol Empire or control all the major trade provinces in Venice, you can't do that without taking other people's land. What does this zero-sum representation of power mean for the game's narrative experience? Well, it basically incentivizes cold, rational, goal-oriented behavior that we can only describe as antisocial. Antisocial behavior is any behavior that seeks to harm or disadvantage others, while prosocial behavior is behavior that seeks to help or cooperate with others. Antisocial behaviors, by definition, create a power dynamic of dominance, obedience, or exploitation, which are terms I'm sure EU4 players can identify with. The game does offer room for temporary collaboration, which can be advantageous in order to confront a threat greater than the temporary ally, but only for the sake of calculated gain. In multiplayer, players are therefore incentivized to help each other only to inevitably betray each other once the opportunity arises, because nearly everything you acquire in the game is something you've taken from someone else. From a narrative perspective, the game seems to be saying that political power ultimately derives from conquest, subjugation, and domination of peoples and territories. I'm going to say this one final time so it's clear. This doesn't mean that the personal belief of the developers aligns with this message. But it is the message of the game, even couched with as many caveats as you want to apply, such as, that's just how things were back then, or that's how the contemporary histories of the period described events, or even, it's just a game and it's made that way for competitive play. Sure, like I said, when I play this game, I totally embody the narratives that emerge from the mechanics. I become the player the game wants me to be. I espouse a form of calculated, rational, antisocial activities that are justified within the narrative framework of the game. Remember earlier when I said the player will inevitably be attacked if they don't strike first? That excuse for conflict can be used to justify almost any real-world atrocity. Violence is the centerpiece of EU4, both mechanically and narratively. As I'm sure is abundantly clear by this point, EU4 is a war game. All aspects of administration of the player's country are ultimately intended to feed the war machine's endless cycle of conquest. In the words of Cato the Elder, bellum se ipsum allet, the war must feed itself, and in EU4, conquest is the way to grow resources in order to conquer further. War in EU4 is a diplomatic interaction, and in the diplomacy screen we can see that the declare war button is at the top, on its own, and in red, just in case you couldn't tell that it's important. The player can declare war on anyone at any time, but there are severe penalties for breaking truces, declaring war on allies, vassals, or countries that you have a royal marriage with, and for declaring war without a cause of war, known as a casus belli. Casus belli are interesting because the players and AI can take things in a peace deal that aren't explicitly their primary war goal, and these extra concessions cost diplomatic power for the victorious country. This narratively expresses how war is usually fought based on a justification that is ultimately just a fabrication for taking a lot more from another country than is initially presented. It's worth noting that the AI will never declare war without a cause, and will never break truces or declare war on an ally. But the player is free to use these against the AI and take a penalty. Primary obstacles to countries expanding too quickly is aggressive expansion, a number that increases for nearby countries anytime a country takes land in a peace treaty. If a country takes too much land too fast, nearby countries have the option to join a coalition against the aggressor and attack them all together, while also having a defensive alliance that prevents coalition members from getting picked off one by one. What this communicates to the player is that power is always expressed through the threat of violence. This is of course resonant with the player's mechanical experience of the game, as EU4 being a war game necessitates that the player's goal be to inflict violence on their neighbors. So this is a game where the player's primary interaction with the world is through violence, either by directly committing it through war or by forming alliances and diplomatic relations in order to be protected from it. And yeah, obviously violence and the threat of violence are essential forms of power that states wield both in the historical period and onward through today. It's crazy, but as I'm writing this section in a cafe, the guy next to me is reading The Art of War by Sun Tzu. War and therefore violence are often seen as the quintessential strategic activity in many cultures, past and present. The guy next to me is presumably not a soldier. He's probably reading The Art of War because he thinks he's going to improve his strategic thinking for applications in business or some other thing. Oh, it turns out he's reading an edition specifically oriented for getting over writer's block and writing better. You see what I mean? The point is that strategic thinking is closely associated with war and violence in modern narratives. But when I say the word violence, you probably think of something chaotic, desperate, irrational, and immoral. When I say war, which is really just legalized violence, you might think of something more calculated, planned, organized, and rational, if not moral. Why is strategy culturally synonymous with war? I mean, this is all over the strategy gaming genre, where most often strategy game means war game. It's no doubt also the reason that the vast majority of the world's most popular games, both competitive and casual, involve violence as one, if not the core gameplay system. I think we should reconsider our relationship to gamified violence. I'm not arguing anything about the cultural or psychological effects of violent video games. That topic is too complicated and contentious, and besides, I don't know anything about it. But what I do know is that strategic thinking doesn't need to be so intertwined with violence. After all, competition is not violence. Strategic planning and execution is not violence. Optimization of systems is not violence, so why do we so often use violence as the representation of the idea of strategy? War in EU4 is fought by armies and navies. Armies are groups of individual regiments, with each regiment holding up to 1,000 soldiers, while navies are collections of ships that require sailors to be recruited. A country's manpower is consumed through the hiring of soldiers, as is some amount of gold currency. Military units also cost gold in maintenance every month, presumably to keep them fed, clothed, armed, and loyal. I don't want to go too deep into the military mechanics in a descriptive way, and for an in-depth view of EU4's military mechanics, I would highly recommend the series by Riemann's Paradox on the topic. Like everything else in this analysis, I want to focus on the narrative that the player experiences through interaction with military mechanics. As I mentioned before, due to the abstract perspective of the game, armies are eternally loyal and obey every command issued by the player. Until recent updates to the game, there was no way to automate any aspect of army orders, meaning they only did what the player commanded them to do. In the real world, of course, military activities during the period and today followed some sort of chain of command that allowed each level of command some limited autonomy in how they followed the orders, or in some case, complete strategic command over an entire army or war theater. The implication of EU4's military command structure is that the state, as embodied by the player, controls the army completely, which is of course not necessarily true ever, but especially in the historical period described where communication lag was an integral part of warfare. This is, after all, a game, and you can imagine that if you were playing chess and your pieces moved around on their own sometimes, or only obeyed you if they agreed with your plans, that would be a really strange experience. Actually, that sounds kind of fun and interesting. Anyway, in EU4, the military institution is merely an instrument of the state, rather than being an institution with authority in its own right, both having influence over the state and being dependent on the state's authority. The representation of the relationship between the military and the state in EU4 could no doubt be an entire video on its own, but for our purposes, I think it's interesting how the player's primary direct interaction with the world is through military command. I like to joke that playing EU4 is like playing a game inside of a spreadsheet, and it's true to some extent, but military command is one exception. To select units, players left-click on them, or click and drag a selection square around them. Once selected, these units can be ordered to move by right-clicking on the destination province. This is the closest thing to an embodied interactive physicality that EU4 provides. Specifically, I mean that the military is the only control the player has over the world that isn't done through a button, a slider, or some other interface panel. In some ways, you can imagine the player as a military decision maker first and foremost, who just so happens to have supreme authority in administration and diplomacy as well. Of course, the actual military management in EU4 necessitates a huge number of interactions with numbers, buttons, sliders, and panels, but that primary interface of interacting with the world map itself is still the centerpiece of the game, both narratively and mechanically. In EU4, when a player moves a unit somewhere, they feel embodied by that position in the game world. Especially during war, armies and navies become quasi-characters with little micro-narratives being played out and experienced in minute-to-minute interactions with the game. Some players even use these opportunities to roleplay specific military or leadership styles, but even for those who don't, I think the mechanical experience of embodying these military units becomes the focal point for physicality for the player. It's almost as though the player interfaces with the world not by playing as a specific ruler nor a specific general, but instead through the abstract idea of playing as any and all military units commanded by the player country, with all the other game systems either serving as fuel or obstacles for this primary interaction. So what happens when war is avoided, and can it be avoided at all? I thought about playing a pacifist run just to be able to write about it analytically here, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Pacifism is widely considered an unintended challenge way to play the game, so I hope that I can justify my choice to avoid it altogether that way. A quick search on YouTube for EU4 pacifist runs should demonstrate the boredom associated with playing pacifist, and will demonstrate that this is not an intended way to play the game. I want to linger for a bit on the idea that EU4 isn't concerned with internal administration as much as it is with war and foreign policy. First, I already mentioned that all authority and sovereignty in the game is directly controlled by the player, except when it is represented through indirect and abstract mechanics like local autonomy or maybe development. But there can be real internal divisions inside the player's country that require management and attention. Local autonomy is linked to unrest, with players being able to increase or decrease autonomy once every few years. Increasing autonomy in a province reduces the productivity of that province, lowering its production, tax, and manpower income, but it also lowers another value, unrest. Provincial unrest is added to a pool based on its source, with the most common being separatist unrest in recently conquered provinces. When unrest is high enough, it increases the odds of a rebellion occurring, and when a rebellion does arrive, it spawns an enemy army into the rebellious province, and sometimes provinces if the rebellion is big enough. Basically, there are things you can do that piss off the people in your country, like lowering taxes or trying to convert them to the state religion, and if they're mad enough at you, they'll arm themselves and rebel. On paper, this sounds like an interesting mechanic. Separatist rebels will try to liberate their territories, which defect back to the original country if they remain occupied for 5 years. Pretender rebels will try to occupy your capital and force you to accept their leader as your monarch. Rebel management is an important part of the game, particularly for inexperienced players who tend to feel unsatisfied with their territorial gains until unrest has dropped below the threshold for rebellion. But for veteran players, rebels are more of a necessary cost and tedious task than they are a mechanically rich representation of dissatisfaction with your totalitarian regime. This experience is fully exacerbated by the mid to late game, where presumably your country is huge and full of diverse cultures and religions and factions that all hate you and want independence or rights. And that's cool on paper. It's true that managing a global and therefore very diverse empire can be complex and requires management of many different factions. But rebels are really tedious. Their sheer weakness and abundance, especially in the mid-game, makes the mechanic best ignored and automated entirely. This led to the inclusion of an order you can give armies to autonomously put down rebel uprisings so that the player can focus on, the actual game. Generally speaking, if game developers have to add in an option for completely automating and ignoring an aspect of the game, that tends to signal that the mechanic is not fulfilling a significant purpose mechanically or narratively. You could potentially argue that the relative weakness of rebels, coupled with their increased frequency throughout the game, is more due to a specific playstyle that ignores many of the bonuses that would have helped prevent rebel armies from spawning, such as bonuses to decrease national unrest, decrease separatism, and increase religious unity. But the point remains, if I spend resources seeking those bonuses, I am still trying to mitigate or remove this aspect of the game. Narratively, rebels are never more than a secondary antagonist for the player. The rebels tend to only succeed through player neglect, or in fact through player opportunism, as rebels can sometimes be beneficial to a country. This is especially true in the early game, where rebels can serve as one more defensive army to use against potential invaders. But rebels can also be used later if their demands align with the goals of the player. The best example of this is pretender rebels that rise up in monarchies, which can offer the player an objectively superior ruler if allowed to enforce their demands. EU4 presents an interesting perspective on the concept of a rebellion, which is in some ways historical because as far as I can tell, the vast majority of uprisings in the time period were put down by government authorities, with the very few exceptions at time making a huge difference in their local political environment. On the other hand, the narrative offered by EU4 on rebellion tends to become oversaturated with historical hindsight. Because we know most rebellions eventually failed historically speaking, the game tends to make putting down constant rebellion a necessary but tedious and trivial activity. The thing is, while we know most rebellions failed, the people who actively took up arms either in support of or to put down rebellion didn't know whether they would fail or not. After all, we're all aware of the storm of revolutions that arrived in Europe during the late 18th and 19th centuries that toppled countless established governments, including centuries-old dynasties. Despite this, many people equate EU4 rebels to zombie outbreaks, both because of the army's generally large size yet relative weakness, and because of the mindlessness associated with putting them down. So I'm comfortable saying that EU4 takes a laid-back perspective on power and rebellion as a whole. In EU4, power derives downward from the state itself, incarnated by the player to the monarch and all the subjects. Subjects never act to concentrate power at its root and push upwards to enact change. The narrative message here is that any reforms that are passed or rebellions that succeed are ultimately the decision of the state incarnated by the player. This has the effect of making the player feel like they are coasting through history, almost like a theme park ride, without any vested interest or stakes when it comes to interacting with citizenry. This would be a perfect time to discuss the concept of revolution with a capital R in EU4, but first we need to talk a little bit about the concept of government itself. Similar to the question of how power is represented in EU4, it's worth examining the representation of government. As I mentioned before, pretty much every country in the game functions the same way at its core. So what differentiates the government mechanics between a small republic like the city-state of Florence, or an ancient collapsing Roman Empire as represented by the country called Byzantium, or for that matter the author of Rome's demise, the Ottoman Turks, soon to become the rising Ottoman Empire? Well, very little. The main difference is specific bonuses that apply to specific government types that are intended to represent the strengths and weaknesses of a given state, but more often the strengths. Another more incidental difference is the presence of specific mechanics that apply to specific government types, which are at times unique to just one country. For example, Prussia has unique mechanics designed to kickstart its historical military reputation for an ultra-disciplined army, while the Ottomans have a decadence mechanic designed to represent the eventual decline of the empire towards the end of the game, despite being the most powerful nation at the start of it. There's a series of governmental reforms that can be enacted throughout a campaign which aim to provide more customization to the player of their government, as well as diversifying the viable playstyles, at least on paper. But I would argue that the minor mechanical differences of government types generally play a smaller role in the unique feel of a country than other factors, such as ideas, which we'll talk about later. Most government types only provide a few bonuses, and while you can change your playstyle around stacking manpower bonuses, for example, that doesn't really provide mechanical depth. Instead, bonuses either from the government type itself or those unlocked through reforms feel more like flavor bonuses that I might stack on top of my wider strategy for optimization rather than a core component of gameplay. The obvious exception is when the bonuses become so overpowered that they can't be ignored, like in the case of Prussia, which is fine, I guess. That's why this section is part of the chapter on power, because governmental mechanics and unique characteristics really just fit to give the player this or that currency, rather than changing how the player expresses their authority. I mean, even the basic idea of a monarch is core to every government in EU4, even if you're playing as a republic, or a tribe, or even a peasant republic. You're still ruled nominally and mechanically by exactly one character called the ruler, and the ruler mechanics are only slightly different from type to type. I can't believe I'm going to praise Imperator Rome again, but that game does have a wider diversity of governmental mechanics that do affect gameplay directly. I'll use the same example as earlier when I mentioned that generals can become disloyal and turn the state's armies against itself. One viable way to prevent that from happening is to take those characters out of the field and instead put them in the government, which is really cool because, as we know, it's common practice both then and now for a head of state to appoint rivals to positions within their administration to prevent them from really rallying external support, and also to benefit from their influence or ability. And sometimes that can backfire, like characters acquiring wealth in those positions that might come back to haunt you later. And that works in Imperator Rome, and it's really cool. But we don't have that in EU4, partially because of the level of abstraction, as mentioned earlier, but also I think because the game was importing design ideas that had been established decades before, as well as trying to incorporate too much diversity of governmental difference within those narrow, mostly Eurocentric design confines. Also, EU4 simply isn't about internal government administration, it's about war and conquest. Despite EU4's generally Eurocentric concept of what a government is, there are a number of notable exceptions to the game's otherwise uniform government mechanics. First, let's take a look at that one country that's not at all near Europe in that list from 2014, which is Japan. Japan starts the game as a completely divided collection of daimyo states, essentially feudal territories that swear fealty to the emperor based in Kyoto. Similar to European medieval feudalism, these feudal lords, despite being sworn to the same highest authority, generally had no clear continuity of statehood between their small feudal holdings, and often competed with each other for power in a kind of warlord battle royale spanning all of Japan. The term generally used to describe this period is Sengoku Jidai, literally the Warring States period. In EU4, this translates mechanically into a form of feudal government where the vassalization does not prevent you from going to war against other vassals of the same overlord. For example, that means that a ruling country from one province in northern Japan is free to conquer their neighbor while still remaining a vassal of the Japanese emperor. Vassals can eventually grow strong enough to try to overthrow the emperor, and if the city of Kyoto is conquered in the peace treaty, the new ruler of the city becomes shogun by controlling the emperor. The early game rumble that is Sengoku Jidai Japan is really appealing to new players because it provides an accelerated microcosm of the game's core progression. Conquer small neighbors until you're strong enough to attack the major players, culminating in the achievement of a clear objective: unite all of Japan under one nation. Japan being a collection of islands prevents any major powers from invading for most of the game, so players have ample time to consolidate their authority in Japan before venturing off to mainland Asia. The geographical and political situation of Japan, coupled with the Daimyos specific mechanics, create an experience that really is unique in EU4. Japan demonstrates how EU4 can shine when it pays close attention to the historical conditions and unique political context of a region in order to craft a distinct experience for players. I think Japan mirrors a lot of the strengths of Europe in this way, but at a smaller scale. The problem comes when the Sengoku Jidai rumble ends. Whether you unite the islands in a decade or you take much longer, eventually Japan is united and becomes just another standard EU4 government with specific bonuses to be sure, but nothing particularly rich in terms of a mechanical experience. And the flip side of Japan's comfortable isolation is that when the islands are united, you're really just an isolated country with few routes for expansion. This brings me to the point I'm trying to make about the unique non-European government content. It's almost always limited in scope or usefulness to make way for the player's eventual transition to standard European-style government mechanics. With Japan united, the unique mechanical experience of playing a Japanese country fades, and players fall back into the European-style meta of basic conquest and raising taxes. Imagine if uniting Japan was not so easily achieved, and if the game systems required much more than simple conquest to maintain the authority of the independent-minded nobility. Such a system would extend the unique experience of playing a Japanese state while also more closely resembling the slow consolidation that Japan saw historically. See, here the game naturally forgoes historical accuracy in favor of a style of play more similar to the mechanics designed for European states. Historically, Japan is said to have unified into a central government at the start of the Edo period, typically dated in 1603 when Tokugawa Ieyasu officially established the shogun system in Edo, which is now Tokyo. Even after this date, which by the way is nearly halfway through the game's time period, the shogunate did not operate like a European monarchy or republic, so why should it play like one? Another noteworthy exception to the generally similar gameplay across EU4 is Ming China. Ming starts the game as the Emperor of China, which is a mechanic that can be claimed by any country in the pagan or Eastern religious groups by declaring war on the current emperor with the casus belli, take mandate of heaven. In practice, however, it's rare for an AI country to successfully claim the Emperor of China title and also become as large as Ming is at the start of the game. So I'll be talking exclusively about Ming as the Emperor of China. The Emperor of China is a unique mechanic that gives Ming very powerful bonuses and malices in accordance with a value called Mandate. If Mandate goes above 50, Ming gets decreased unrest, war exhaustion, and increased estate loyalty. But if Mandate goes below 50, the country takes severe penalties to its military fighting capability, its unrest, and its economy. In addition to maintaining the Mandate, the Emperor can enact celestial reforms and decrees which provide significant bonuses to many aspects of the country. We'll talk more about the implications of religious content in the game in a later part, but for now, it's interesting to note how because of the Mandate system, Ming is probably the only country in the game that isn't immediately encouraged to expand using the game's standard philosophy of domination and conquest. This is because the Emperor gains mandate primarily through maintaining dependent tributary states on its borders. These countries pay tribute to Ming every year while also being protected by Ming in case of attack. So Ming gets the tribute, which can be in the form of money, manpower, or monarch points, and the tributary gets protection from invasion. The difference between this gameplay and that of most other countries in EU4 is that countries bordering the player are generally those that the player will attack next, because the simplest way to claim lands requires bordering them. This means that as Ming expands its tributaries, which it has to do for the sake of its mandate, it is also closing off typical avenues of territorial expansion. The same can be said of the Aztecs, whose Doom mechanics require continual reform through constant war with nearby neighbors. Doom is technically a religious mechanic for Nahual nations, but in practice is more similar to a government mechanic as it dictates the core authority of the player and the playstyle required to manage it. Essentially, the gameplay involves conquering all neighbors, then collapsing when a reform is enacted, then reconquering all neighbors and repeating these steps until the final reform. And this is where the Aztecs mirror the Japanese or Chinese unique mechanics, in that there is a general end to when the unique mechanics need to be abided, after which gameplay reverts to the general EU4 formula of complete player control and continuous territorial conquest. But for the Aztecs, Eurocentrism is taken to another level. In order to enact the final government reform, the player must border a country that has an institution of feudalism. In practice, this means a European colonial power in the New World. The final reform converts the Aztec government into a government type of the neighboring country. According to the wiki, this means becoming parliamentary if the Aztecs border Great Britain, a monarchy if they border Portugal or Spain, and a republic if they border a colonial nation, which is what the colonial puppet states in the Americas are called. This is the perfect example to end this point on, as the end goal for the Aztec player is to become European in terms of governmental structure and playstyle. EU4's developers did create unique government content and gameplay experiences for countries outside of Europe, but in each case, the effectiveness of the unique government mechanics limits their in-game longevity, and players have to revert to the European style of government as soon as the unique mechanics run out. This has a narrative effect of implying that all world governments in EU4 are converging towards the Western model of monarchical imperialism, which is both inaccurate and Eurocentric. The other issue here is that because governments outside of Europe feel underbaked by the mid-game, players experience an implicit devaluation of the richness of government structures outside of Europe, and the feeling that really nothing interesting was going on in terms of statehood during this period. Narratively, this hammers home the centrality of European imperialism on the world stage, which is definitely what the devs were going for. And while European imperialism has dominated much of the globe in many ways since the 15th century in the real world, I don't think the game benefits from having such a narrow perspective on potential alternate histories. For example, a skilled player playing as the Aztecs can in most cases invade Europe and even dominate the entire world. This really is a core part of the fun of playing EU4, the fact that the player's choices can change the course of all world history. But for the Aztecs to be forced to become a European-style government in order to achieve that world conquest suggests that even if another civilization had created global empires as Europe eventually did during this period, that they would have had to do it in the European way. And that simply isn't true, as we know throughout history and even today, as the remnants of European imperialism are slowly but surely fading from the globe. I'll be revisiting this idea of alternate histories encouraged only if they maintain a European supremacy when we talk about the economic narratives in a later section, so stay tuned for that. I'm pretty sure EU4 would be considered counter-revolutionary to someone who was a contemporary of the revolutions in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It may be unsurprising given everything we know about the game so far, but from a mechanical narrative perspective, players start out definitively on the anti-revolutionary side of history. Revolution in EU4 is actually a system of mechanics working in tandem to give the player an experience of navigating the tumultuous revolutionary period as an insider and decision maker. Revolution spawns from a single province called the birthplace of revolution, more on that later, and from there spreads randomly to nearby provinces. The presence of revolution raises autonomy proportionally to a country's absolutism, which is basically a number measuring how tyrannical your leadership is. This forces the player to embrace the revolution if enough provinces are converted in order to remove the malice, but there's another way to become revolutionary, which is through the revolution disaster. Disasters in EU4 are events that can trigger if certain negative conditions for a country are met, like having an illegitimate ruler, low stability, or high national unrest. When the revolution disaster triggers, it spawns huge numbers of what the game calls rebels, which in this case are citizens fighting for their rights and for a new form of government. Players have the choice of allowing the rebels to take control of the country and become revolutionary, or fight back and try to stamp out the revolution, both scenarios being choices made by real governments in history. In either case, the player will have to fight rebels to enforce their demands, possibly highlighting how even social movements use the violent methods of the regimes they claim to oppose. When the revolution is successful, the player gains a lot of positive bonuses for being a revolutionary nation, as well as mechanics for spreading the revolution to neighboring countries through war. The narrative result of this experience is that revolution, like a lot of government mechanics, doesn't really provide a unique experience for the power structures to be reorganized. Revolutionary or not, you don't have to contend with newly enfranchised citizens or share your authoritarian power with any institutions. It's the same game, except now your country has revolutionary added to its name, which is why I personally never allow revolution to appear when I play EU4, because all pro EU4 players know that the real progression is the size of your name on the world map. The content of revolutionary mechanics in EU4 are as Eurocentric as it gets, which in this case actually makes sense. The Age of Revolutions, as it's known in historiography and in the game itself, was fundamentally a response to European ideas of government that had ripple effects all over the world, both the European-controlled parts and the independent parts. There's nothing wrong with showing that in the game, but it's noteworthy that the game emphasized the revolutionary mechanics as a global phenomenon, when really they are a European phenomenon as shown by the European conceptualization of government and revolution. So which is it? Is the revolution global? If so, the content needs to be less European focused. Or is the revolution a regional event in Europe and her colonies? In that case, it should not be a core mechanic of the game, but instead a regional mechanic like Japan's Sengoku Jidai or China's Mandate of Heaven. To be fair, revolutionary mechanics can be ignored to a degree for players outside Europe. This is partly because the revolution appears based on a series of conditions which largely disqualified non-European provinces from being the birthplace of the revolution. According to the wiki, provinces outside Europe have a mean time to trigger of 20 times those within Europe, which means that outside of Europe, the revolution has an average time to spawn of 6,000 years. On top of that, provinces that are far from the capital have even lower odds of spawning the revolution. Meaning, for example, that if an Asian country controlled half of Europe but kept its capital in Asia, it too would have practically no shot at being the birthplace of revolution. Just like when we get to the Industrial Revolution in the section on economic narratives, I want to make the point that it's not inherently bad to demonstrate how European systems spread across the globe, because of course, they did. At the same time, it's important not to overestimate European influence and therefore underestimate the agency of non-European peoples when it comes to these global phenomena. Power is a slippery thing to define and represent. A lot of video games center around the acquisition and expression of power as a tool for entertainment for the player. I think in a lot of ways, power fantasies are present all throughout mass media art. Look at the prevalence of superhero stories in the last century, as well as a lot of fantasy and science fiction power scaling stories like Star Wars, Harry Potter, The Hunger Games, or Aragon. Look at the frequency of narrative archetypes that center around the story of an up-and-coming character, like a boxer or a future tech CEO or even a civil rights leader. People like stories that make them feel empowered, and the best way to do that is to have a character or player start out in a disenfranchised position and slowly grow to surmount the obstacles that once held them back. EU4 undoubtedly achieves this in the right conditions. Starting as a small country, only a local power or even not a power at all, getting bullied now and then throughout the early game, finally beating back that local bully by the mid-game, and ultimately becoming a global power or even a world conqueror by the end. That's an incredible narrative experience for players. Like I talked about in the introduction, EU4 bullies you with insurmountable odds and vastly complex game systems to master, then rewards you for overcoming all of those obstacles. But what is the cost of overcoming the neighborhood bully or even the continental superpower? To beat back the tyranny of encroaching neighbors is to become the tyranny of invader. To let the global casualty numbers rise into the millions as soldiers and resources are poured into the carnage of your conquest. I don't think EU4 is trying to be a commentary on the unsustainable nature of imperialism and violence. There are some events and content that poke fun at the tyranny of your regime, but the game never comes across as especially self-aware about its messages about power, namely that power is earned through the exploitation of disenfranchised peoples and maintained through the violence and the threat of violence against those peoples. To wrap up this first part, I want to consider how the experience of empowerment in EU4 necessitates the subjugation of other peoples. How can it be that historic empowerment of one country, one group, one nation necessitates the exploitation, dominance, and genocide of another? It's easy for us to sit back and say EU4 is just a game. It's easy to say that domination and exploitation are constants throughout history, and that therefore there's no reason for them to disappear anytime soon. Or for us to just say, that's how people were from 1444 to 1821, that they were immoral or just ignorant of the horrors of their societies. But I think those are lazy answers. It's important to consider the narratives of power in our own society because they form the foundation of our interactions with our governments, with other countries, with other peoples, and even with individuals we encounter day to day. The narratives we adopt without realizing are the ones that we will automatically turn to when things get complicated or painful or shameful. It's impossible to be immune to dominant cultural narratives in our time and place, but we can be more aware and critical of them and ourselves. And intentionally or not, I think that really is the whole point of art, to make us examine and re-examine ourselves and our world.